At the end of September, Clara Weller's neighbors stopped chopping firewood. They began caulking windows, reinforcing roofs, and collecting the last buckets of water before the streams turned to glass. That's what everyone did, but Clara was doing something else. She was building a barn on top of her own house. Not to the side, not behind. Above, a larger structure, erected like a shell of wood and earth over his old log cabin. This isn't morning work. It's confusion, someone murmured in the market. They called it a waste, hysteria, silent madness. Some offered help, not out of respect, but out of pity. She refused, and continued stacking logs. The first snowfall occurred before October was over. In November, supplies began to disappear under the snow. In December, the wood ran out, but no one forgot about the house that had disappeared inside a barn, and nobody knew what was still alive inside. The area around Little Knife Creek was made of silence, wind, and damp wood. The newly arrived families lived scattered miles apart, each trying to pretend that this was the beginning of something. They called it the beginning. Clara Weller called it proof. Widowed since last autumn, Clara lived alone on a small plot of low-lying land, where the mist lay over the grass until nearly midday. She had 3 children, all young, and none of them could say precisely when was the last time they heard their mother laugh. The cabin was simple: sloping roof, clogged chimney, windows that rattled in the wind. The husband, Caleb, had left the basic structure before being crushed to death by a falling log. It was quick. What came after didn't. The first winter was a series of silences. Firewood cut in September, half burned in January. Chairs were turned into fuel in February. Parts of the ground disappeared in March. Clara didn't cry. She didn't talk about it. She didn't ask for help. When the thaw came, she just went outside, walked around what was left, and stared. While the other women sewed or planted, Clara watched the rooftops. She gathered clumps of earth with roots. She noted wind directions with small twigs in the ground. She spoke little. She did much. The neighbors were surprised when she started building new walls. Not next to the cabin, but all around it. First came the blocks of rammed earth. Then, vertical beams, angled to support a roof that didn't yet exist. She used improvised tools. She hammered alone. She carried more weight than she should have. At the local shop, men chatted between sips of weak coffee. He's building a barn on top of his own house. Perhaps she thinks her husband will come back. Or do you want to get rid of everything at once? Others chuckled softly. They said it was the kind of thing a woman did when no one else said no to her. Some women looked on with pity. 1 or 2 even tried to talk, offering a loom, an afternoon of sewing together. Clara thanked them. It didn't happen. She wasn't arrogant. She was absent-minded. And when the village children asked why her house was turning into something else, one of the boys replied, "That's because hers almost disappeared last winter. Now she wants to hide the house before the cold hides it again." Nobody really understood, but the image remained. A house hidden inside a barn. The strange thing wasn't the barn. It was the way she built it. Clara didn't dismantle the cabin. She didn't reuse the logs, nor did she move the original structure. She fenced it off, as if to say, "This will remain." The new walls were made of blocks of grass and root, cut with a bread knife and stacked like bricks. They weighed almost 10 kilos each. She collected them from the edges of the field, where the soil was dense and the winds less frequent. It took her hours to carry just a few meters. She would return covered in dried mud and dead leaves. Her hands were cut. Her shoulders were worn out. But she kept going. At the end of each day, Clara would write small measurements on a piece of fabric tied around her waist. The height of the roof, the slope of the beams, the distance between the new and old walls. A span of 6 paces, always the same. This space would become the difference between cold and fire. As the roof began to take shape, the neighbors started showing up more often. Not to help, but to watch. One of them, Mr. Hartley, approached one morning with a bucket of nails and a comment. "If you want, I can help you put this up properly. You're wasting wood." She looked at the bucket. Then she looked at the house. It's already stood up once. It just needs to endure one more winter. He didn't understand. He left the nails on the ground and went away. The children in the area began to invent stories. They said she was building a prison or a sanctuary, that there were ghosts within the walls. She's hiding something. The house within the house. The husband died, but perhaps he hasn't gone away. Clara heard everything, but she said nothing. What nobody knew was that throughout that summer, She had been filling the corridors between the cabin and the barn with logs. Cut logs dried, stacked in the shade. He did this every day, even when it rained, even when my hands hurt. One of the neighbors even commented, "She has enough firewood for 3 winters, but she has no one to talk to." Another replied, "Better to die in silence than from the cold." And they both laughed. Brief, low. On the last day of September, Clara placed the last log in the south opening, and she closed the double door with an improvised iron latch. There was no ceremony, no fuss, only dry wood, silence, and the sound of the leaves beginning to change color. The barn was ready. The cabin was still there, inside. What remained to be known, if that were enough. The first snowfall occurred at the end of October. It wasn't announced. It just arrived. In the morning, Clara opened the barn door and found the field covered in white, silent, still. The firewood piled around her remained dry, untouched. She picked up some logs with her bare hands and fed the wood-burning stove inside the original cabin, now surrounded by earthen walls and silence. The children still slept together, huddled under the blankets she had sewn herself the previous summer. The youngest, Elias, murmured nonsense in his sleep. The oldest, Ruth, kept her eyes open even when she said she was asleep. On the second day of snow, the wind picked up. Not an ordinary wind. He was the type who squeezed through cracks, tore rags, and buzzed in the wood, as if he wanted to remind us that the world was not at peace. The houses around began to creak. In the village, some men took the initiative. They reinforced their fences, unearthed carts, and improvised shelter for firewood. Others simply looked at the sky and said, "It's early, but winter doesn't listen." A week later, the piles of wood around the other houses were already covered. Clara, on the other hand, walked in thick socks through the corridors between her cabin and the barn walls. The logs remained accessible, dry, warm to the touch. She did it silently, every morning. The ritual: open the inner door, gather firewood, close it. No rush, without fear. Ruth once asked, "Why didn't we run when everyone else ran?" Clara responded with another question. "What do you do when you know it's going to rain?" The girl thought, "Put away the clothes." "So we just stored them beforehand," Clara said, and went back to cutting potatoes. While the cold hardened the windows of other houses, inside Clara's cabin, the heat accumulated. It wasn't abundant. It was constant. The difference between survival and despair was not the size of the flame, but its permanence. One day, while tending the fire, Clara heard a sound coming from outside. Steps. It was Mr. Hartley, his beard covered in ice and his gaze downcast. He didn't knock. He just stood there observing the structure he had previously called a waste. "My fence collapsed. The cattle escaped." "I'm sorry," said Clara, still seated. "The firewood is buried. I don't know if—" He didn't finish the sentence. Clara stood up. She picked up a small armful of logs from the hallway and handed them over without a word. He accepted, averting his eyes. "Thanks. It's going to snow even more," she said, going back inside. The next morning, there were children's footprints around the barn. Someone small had tried to get to the house. "Go back. Try again." Clara looked through the crack in the barn, but she didn't see anyone. He only understood what was coming next. Winter isn't knocking at the door. He infiltrates. 2 weeks after Mr. Hartley's visit, the wind changed. It began to blow from the west, heavy and damp, heralding the worst snowstorm since records had begun. Clara woke up to a sharp crack in the middle of the night. The noise came from above, from the highest beam of the outer roof. He got out of bed without lighting the lamp. He picked up the iron spatula and walked into the hallway. There, he noticed, the roof of the barn was beginning to buckle under the accumulated weight of the snow. It was too early for that to happen. With her shoulders already aching, Clara put on her boots, donned her thick coat, and pushed open the side door of the barn. The wind almost pushed her back. It was snowing sideways, as if the sky had been turned upside down. She went back inside, climbed onto a chair, and began pushing against the ceiling with the shovel handle. Be careful. No rush. Just to relieve pressure on the most vulnerable points. One of the children woke up to the noise. Elias, too young to understand what was happening. "Is it falling?" he whispered. "Not yet," Clara replied, without getting off the bus. That morning, Clara made the wrong decision. She tried to reinforce the outer roof by herself during the wind. She climbed up with ropes and wood, but the makeshift ladder slipped. She fell on her right shoulder and for a few minutes couldn't get up. The snow continued to fall. He crawled inside. He tied his arm close to his body with cloths, and he continued lighting the fire with his left hand. The logs were there, accessible, but every move was costly. On the second day of the snowstorm, the smoke from the chimney decreased. Ruth realized. She tried to feed the fire, but she was too small. She trembled from the lack of heat. Elias began to cough. On the night of the third day, Clara woke up to a muffled sound, a faint cry. He walked to the barn door. The lock had frozen. She hit her. Once, twice. Nothing. He went to the back and pulled the makeshift latch with his teeth. The wood gave way. Outside, half buried in the snow, was a boy. He wasn't one of theirs. It was Thomas, the youngest of the Blakes from the farm half a mile away. He was trembling. His lips were bluish. His skin was colorless. In his hands he held 2 pieces of damp wood. He was trying to find warmth. Clara didn't hesitate. She pulled him inside, wrapped him in cloths and placed him between her children. Ruth, without asking, divided the blanket. Elias held the boy's hand, confused. That night, Clara burned more logs than on any other day. Smoke started billowing out of the chimney again, thicker, more consistent. The fire held out until dawn. The following morning, looking through a crack in the outside wall, Clara saw a figure in the distance. It was the boy's mother, desperate, going in circles. Clara didn't leave. He didn't scream. He simply pushed the door open, and he let the woman see her. Mrs. Blake ran. She fell. She got up, and when she went inside, she saw her son sleeping. He didn't say anything. She just cried silently. Clara watched her. Then he gathered more firewood, and he put it on the fire. That night the structure creaked again, but he didn't give in. January arrived without asking permission, and with it, the cruelest silence of winter. It wasn't the silence of the snow, but the silence of absence. There was no dry firewood in the other houses, absence of movement in the fields, no smoke coming from the chimneys. The visits stopped. The horses disappeared from the tracks. The carts were left buried in white. Inside Clara's barn, everything seemed still, yet alive. The children woke up without crying. They ate in silence. They went to bed early. The fire never completely went out. Sometimes low, sometimes hesitant, but always there. The heat wasn't comfort, it was permanence. She had set aside enough logs for 2 winters. I had already used almost half of it. The pain in her shoulder persisted, but she had learned to use her body sparingly. Every movement was deliberate, almost calculated. Each step inside the barn was slow, measured, silent. Outside, the days turned gray. The white of the snow was covered by grayish layers of blown ice. The light faded before afternoon. Time seemed to stand still. That's when the orders started coming in. The first one was shy, a distant neighbor. He knocked on the barn door with his hands covered by cloths and his gaze averted. "Do you have anything dry?" Clara didn't answer. She simply picked up 5 logs and handed them over. The man thanked them without looking up. The following week, others came, some with their children, others without their own horses. The news had spread. Clara Weller had dry firewood, and it's hot, but she also had something else, what remained of her strength. Each order was a burden, because each delivery meant fewer guaranteed days for their loved ones. Ruth realized. "What if it ends, Mom?" Clara did not answer. He simply started locking the hallway at night, not out of selfishness, but for safety reasons. At the end of January, one of the nearest houses collapsed under the weight of the accumulated ice. Inside, there was an elderly couple. Only one survived. Clara helped with the digging, she and 2 other men in silence. They took the body inside Hartley's house, which was now trembling more than the others. Hartley was the last to ask. It took days, but it appeared, soaked, with purple hands, the daughter in her lap, feverish. He didn't speak. He just waited. Clara opened the door. He made a gesture. They went inside. There was no conversation. Hartley stayed for 3 days. During the early morning hours, he tried to feed the fire himself. He made a mistake in choosing the firewood. It almost erased everything. Clara woke up to the smell of cold smoke. Corrected. It reignited. He didn't blame him. The next day, Hartley placed a log in her arms and said, "This one came from the fence you said wouldn't last. You were right." She nodded, and he accepted. By the end of February, the snow began to melt. Small puddles formed along the edges of the fence, but the wood inside the barn was still dry. Clara's house was never warm, but it was never too cold. It was enough. It always has been. Spring didn't arrive all at once. She crawled. First came the color. The white of the snow began to be stained with earth. Then the sounds, water dripping from eaves, wood creaking in the timid sun. Finally the bodies, people leaving their houses slowly, as if they had forgotten how to walk. The community around Little Knife Creek was no longer the same. 2 empty houses, 3 children buried under the ice, a father who lost his fingers, a mother who lost her voice. When the first wagons managed to break through the icy paths, they brought little, will, oat, and silence. It was a kind of collective grief that didn't know where to look. Then they looked at the barn. Clara was still gathering firewood, even in March, even with the thaw. I knew the wind would return when you least expected it. One by one, the neighbors began to approach, not with requests, but with questions. How did you get so much firewood? Why did you cover everything? Where did you learn that? She responded very little. I saw someone do something similar. In the East. I saved what I could. I thought it could go wrong. No one mocked them anymore. The children started playing in the corridors between the cabin and the barn. The space that once seemed strange was now a shelter. One of the men, the same one who had laughed in the market months before, brought dry beams. If you want to reinforce the north wall, it looks like it will last another winter. She thanked him, and he left it aside. Ruth helped organize. Elias learned how to cut blocks of earth. Thomas, the boy rescued in the storm, returned with his mother weeks later. They brought bread and a handmade blanket. They stayed for an hour. They didn't say much. They only looked at the structure, the corridors, the logs that were still left. Mr. Hartley started coming on Sundays. He brought tools, remained silent, and worked. Clara didn't ask why, he didn't explain either. But before leaving, he always left 2 logs near the inner door, dry, clean, as an answer. The story of the house inside the barn spread, not with headlines, but in hushed voices around the fire. Some started to copy, others adapted. A new type of construction was emerging. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't fast, but it was enough, and Clara Weller never asked for recognition. It just kept the fire burning. Clara Weller's barn didn't become an attraction. It didn't appear in the newspaper. It wasn't drawn on maps. But he stayed. Year after year, the wind returned. The snow has returned. The cold tried again. And the house remained standing. In the second winter following the snowstorm, 3 new families erected similar structures. One of them used the outdoor space to store grain. Another woman created an indoor corral with chickens that heated the ground. Clara was watching, but he didn't give his opinion. She did not become a leader. It didn't become a benchmark. It became the margin, a constant, firm, discreet presence. The children grew up amidst corridors of firewood and walls of living earth. Ruth learned to sew while watching the smoke from the chimney. Elias invented ways to stack wood that dried faster. The barn became more than just shelter. It became the norm. It became a memory. Over time, more houses adopted the same principle. Protect the warmth before the cold arrives. It wasn't just about firewood. It was about thinking differently. Observe before reacting. Decades later, visitors to the region heard scattered stories. There was a woman who built a barn on top of her own house. She survived with her children without help. Her fire never went out. Nobody could quite remember the name, but they remembered the structure. In the end, Clara wasn't the legacy. It was the space between the walls, that gap of 6 steps, full of wood, full of meaning. Some ideas are not announced. They emerge when the world gets tough, when the cold seeps in through cracks that no one sees. When survival requires more than strength, it requires attention. Clara Weller did not survive the winter. She didn't fight him. He simply built something that the cold didn't understand. And in the end, it wasn't the wood, not the earth, not even fire. It was the space between the walls, the place where time could stand still without taking everything with him.